Time for my favorite segment of the show. John McMullen with us each day here at 4 o'clock. Johnny Mac, what is that? I know everybody goes to the wrestling stuff, but the music's from Space Odyssey, right? Do you know the name of the piece?
Space Odyssey 2000. That's the theme. That's what it is. Space Odyssey 2000.
Right. So you're our version of Hal, clearly smarter than the rest of the folks out there, right? Tell us.
I don't know if I'm smarter, but right now I'm colder. I can tell you that. It is freezing out.
Yeah, we had Steve Coates on in the last hour, and he said it was 80 in Florida. It was all Nick and I could do to not mutter some expletives back at him as the Flyers play the Panthers tonight. Eagles, of course, gearing up for the Cowboys, John, and today was just an open locker room day. No coaches, no coordinators speaking, but the locker room open for players to talk. And Nick Foles, I guess, did talk as well. You heard that soundbite there in the update. And you write on our website, John, on 97.3 ESPN, figure on Foles getting some work versus the Cowboys. There have been some people out there that have said perhaps he would just sit completely and you could have Sudfeld as the starting quarterback. And yes, that's a possibility, but you're thinking more that Nick Foles is going to get some work on Sunday.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it has to do with the performance on Christmas night against the Raiders, which obviously was not very sharp from an offensive perspective. And Doug kind of intimated on Monday when he spoke last that he needs more reps, to be honest. And at some point you can't worry about the injuries. You just have to coach. And you have to prepare the team as best as possible. And Nick confirmed today he's preparing to be the starter. Nothing's changed from that perspective. But it'll be interesting to see how long it lasts because I think the main goal is to get some confidence back in him and this offense. And maybe if they start quickly and score a touchdown right away, it's just a cameo. Maybe it lasts to the half. I can't imagine it going into the third quarter or anything of that nature because the issue, remember, if Nick starts, and he will, then the rest of the offense has to start because it really doesn't do any good if you have Nick Foles playing with backup players, and obviously they don't want to put him behind backup offensive linemen. So by starting him, that means all your offensive starters have to be out there. So that's another sort of something you have to put into the equation, and it affects the thought process of the whole thing.
Well, and John McMullen's with us. You summed it up so well in your headline on the website on 97.3 ESPN.com, rest versus rust. I thought if I was still back in my TV days, I would steal that one, John. I would take that and I would put that as the text in the over-the-shoulder box. Rest versus rust is the text, sort of as the storyline. And that's really the debate, isn't it, about which way is the right way to proceed?
Yeah, and there really is no answer. I mean, both have worked in the past and both have failed. So ultimately it depends on who you're talking to and how you don't have to go back very far. The Dallas Cowboys were in the same situation last year in Week 17 against the Eagles. They were the team that was rolling and had the first-round bye and didn't have anything to play for. And they rested everybody. They didn't play Ezekiel Elliott. They didn't play Tyron Smith. Dak Prescott played about a quarter. Then they went to Tony Romo. And ultimately, they never won another game. They lost to the Eagles. They had their bye week, and they ran into Aaron Rodgers and the Packers, and it was one and done for the Dallas Cowboys. So it can blow up on you. There's no question about it. But the rest argument is the one where it's pretty logical. And the fact that you want to go into the playoffs as healthy as possible with as many as your key components, your key stars available. And you know, it would be a shame to lose someone of that stature in a meaningless game. So, it's really an argument that's sort of the chicken or the egg. There's no real answer, and it all depends on hindsight. And if it ultimately works, obviously, if the Eagles go on to the Super Bowl, people will say, hey, what a great decision Doug made. And if they lose, he'll be the dumbest guy in the world, and that's why he's got a tough job.
Shocking. Philadelphia fans using the words idiot and moron. That never happens around the Delaware Valley. John McMullen with us. Hey, you talk about losing a guy of that stature, and we didn't get into this yesterday, and that's on me, John, because it was my first day back, and I hadn't fully read all the materials out there, I suppose, because Sean McVay came out talking about that he might, or it looks like they're going to rest a lot of their guys against San Francisco, so he's taking that tactic of rest. But I thought your piece was very interesting when you say not only is he resting, but he's resting because they want the Eagles. What does that signal to you that all of a sudden nobody's afraid of the team that, by the way, happens to be the number one seed?
Yeah, it's and I wrote it's kind of arrogant what Sean McVay is doing because it's pretty transparent. I mean, he's trying to set up a second-round matchup where they come here to visit Philadelphia. Remember, they went to Minneapolis earlier in the year, and they got trounced by the Vikings. It was their worst game of the year. They scored on their first drive, never scored again. By far their worst defensive performance, offensive performance. So they see what it's like to play there against a Mike Zimmer defense, and they didn't like it. And now they see a wounded Eagles team without Carson Wentz, obviously, and that makes them a more desirous opponent. But, you know, the arrogant part comes from the fact that, A, you got to win your first-round game. And B, as I said, you're kind of setting yourself up that if you do win it, you got to come to Philadelphia. And let's be honest, I mean, I just told you how cold it is today. Now, it could warm up by then, but it's generally probably going to be a pretty cold day, whether it's January 13th or 14th, and you're a Los Angeles team with a California kid playing quarterback. I'm not sure this would be the best environment. And the Eagles are still a 13-2 team. But, hey, that's what Sean McVay decided. We talked to Zach Ertz in the locker room. He said that's their right if they want to set it up. And ultimately the Eagles will play who's ever put in front of them. And that's the thing about these playoffs. When everyone thinks about jockeying, who would you rather play, who's more difficult, bottom line is the NFC is so deep this year, you're going to face a good football team from either end, whether you're traveling, whether you're at home like Philadelphia. And who knows? I could see a scenario where the Eagles and the Vikings get upset in the divisional round. And all of a sudden, you have the two likely the top seeds. The Vikings still haven't clinched number 2, but likely will on Sunday. I could see them both being upset.
John, you mentioned how good these teams are once you reach the postseason, and I want to get back to Nick Foles a little bit too, knowing that he needs the work this week. Whether he plays a half, whether he plays 3 quarters, whatever he does, he needs the reps and needs to build up that rapport with his wide receivers. Now, when you think about it, isn't this sort of a test this weekend? Because Dallas is, I mean, they're not that good of a team as they were last year, but they're still a desperate team. They have guys playing for jobs. Wouldn't you think this is the best test for Nick Foles to get reps and to get some more confidence going into the playoffs? Because you know you're going to face a really tough team like the Rams, the Saints, or even the Panthers or Falcons in the divisional round of the playoffs.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about test-wise. I think the confidence part of that is the bigger issue because the Cowboys don't have much to play for. You're right. I mean, everybody in this league doesn't want to put bad film up there because they are looking for a job next year, whether it's with their current teams or a potential future team. So from that perspective, you have personal pride, and most players do, but we see it all over the league that when teams sort of bow out of playoff contention, sometimes they check out early. So I by no means do I think you're going to see a Dallas Cowboys team fighting and clawing to the last minute to try and win this football game. It's not meaningful for them either. So I don't know if I buy into that part of it. But, yeah, after the performance against the Raiders, it doesn't matter what Nick Foles says, what he does. He can't have a lot of confidence right now. And you want to sort of bolster that up a little bit. You want to give him a buoy. You got to get him thinking right. You got to get him having some success because he could not get the football outside the numbers at all against the Raiders, who are not a very good defensive team. And part of that might have been the weather. It was a gusty, windy day, obviously very, very cold. But he claims that wasn't an issue. So right now you have a team that's coming off a game against a bad defense that was 1 of 14 on third downs, and they need to get some confidence.
John, you mentioned Nick Foles not making those throws, and one guy who he was trying to throw to but did not make a catch on Monday was Alshon Jeffrey. Now, Alshon Jeffrey had some interesting comments earlier this week after that game where he didn't throw Nick Foles under the bus, and he kind of alluded to his poor performance as a team aspect and that he needs to get better. Is that a demonstration of how good this team chemistry is and how much these guys trust each other? Because if you take the other example on the flip side, Landon Collins of the Giants completely threw his teammate Eli Apple under the bus. So, I mean, is that actually a good sign, knowing that Alshon Jeffrey did not put the blame on Nick Foles, considering he was the backup quarterback for all season long until Wentz went down?
Yeah, but, real quick, to defend Landon Collins, he was right. But,
of course. I mean, John, we can argue about that all day. Yeah. Eli Apple's been a problem all season long, no matter where he was.
But Alshon, that's Alshon's personality. He's not your typical diva personality. When he has a big game, he doesn't sort of boast. He doesn't stick out his chest. And when he has a bad game, he's not going to throw the quarterback under the bus. He's a very soft-spoken guy, very understated guy, and it's rare at that position to have somebody like that, especially with his type of success. But I think you bring up an important point. We're all focusing on Nick Foles, and by no means am I trying to say he didn't play poorly, because he played very poorly. But part of the reason he did play poorly is that the rest of the offense also didn't perform. And part of that was the receivers, whether it was the Aguilar drop, whether it was not getting separation. I don't think Alshon was open very much, and he did get 2 targets. One, Nick tried to sort of put it on his back shoulder because he didn't want to lead him into the defender, which could have been a big play. But you got to get him more involved. And he's that type of guy who can be a 50-50, win those battles and catch those 50-50 balls. And that's the thing I'm more concerned with Nick Foles, because if you can go all the way back to 2013 when Nick was having the 27-2 year, he's always been a guy that throws to open receivers. In other words, so many patterns with great quarterbacks especially are anticipation throws, and they'll often have the ball in the air before the receiver even comes out of his break. That's not Nick Foles. Nick Foles waits for a guy to break open. And sometimes, not sometimes, all the time, and constantly, and Nick said it today, Alshon is open even when he's not open, and what they mean by that is he's got the huge catching radius. He can catch the 50-50 balls, and sometimes you have to give him that opportunity. And Nick is just not comfortable making that type of throw, and I don't think that's changing because it's just not in his DNA as a player.
Now, you mentioned the rest that these guys are going to get on Sunday, whether the offense plays an entire half or, as I mentioned before, 3 quarters if possible. You mentioned if Foles is in there, the entire starting offense is going to be in there. And now I'm focusing on the running game. Jay Ajayi, obviously, it seems like he's the number 1 back, but still doesn't get the bulk of the carries as a number 1 running back truly would get. How much could we expect to see Ajayi keep the momentum going if he is in there on Sunday, or do we expect to see more of LeGarrette Blount and Corey Clement on Sunday?
Well, I think it's pretty clear Jay is the top of the committee now, whereas that used to be LeGarrette's job. But I don't think the committee aspect is changing. And Doug mentioned that also last week when we keep asking him. And he said he's a proponent of the old adage that if it's not broke, don't fix it. And for the majority of this season, they've run the ball effectively. They've run it with a committee, which is really 4 different players. If you add in Kenyon Barner, because he seems to get a couple touches each week, or at least a couple reps each week. But the one thing about Jay, he's been very effective in his touches, but he's also fumbled twice at the end of big run. And that impacts into a coach's thinking as far as playing time as well. You can't put the football on the ground in big situations. And as you head to the postseason, Jay Ajayi has already fumbled it twice, and that's a concern.
John McMullen with us here on the Sports Pass on 97.3 ESPN. His appearance on the show brought to you by Geno's, the winemaker's choice for 50 years. Visit Geno Pinto on the White Horse Pike in Hamilton. Online at genopinto.com. Geno's, the winemaker's choice for 50 years. John, before we whip around with a couple things from the NFL, sort of NFL news and notes, we'll finish up with Thursday notes, if you will, from the NovaCare complex. And it's only a walkthrough, right? I mean, they've only been doing walkthroughs at practice, so tough to really interpret the injury report. But there are some people that are dealing with injury. And who do you think is most likely to not play Sunday, be injury-related?
Well, I think that's Brandon Graham, who hurt his ankle. I think it's a high ankle sprain. He's moving around pretty well. He's been in the locker room. And I think he'll be fine for the playoffs long term. But he's the only player, and remember, it's an estimation in the walkthrough because it's not an actual practice, that has not participated on either of the last 2 days, Wednesday or Thursday. So you're not going to see Brandon Graham against the Dallas Cowboys. Everybody else has been able to participate. That means Stefan Wisniewski is getting closer, but I would imagine they would err on the side of caution with him as well. And make sure he's ready for the opening playoff game. And that's sort of going to be the litmus test. If anybody is having any issues whatsoever from an injury perspective, I mean, you just shouldn't play them. And so some of the other names you could be looking at is Jalen Mills, who's been dealing with an ankle, Derek Barnett with a groin, Daniel Ellerbe, who's now the starting middle linebacker, has got a quad. So those are some of the players dealing with some slight injuries, but they've all been able to participate in the walkthroughs. So it's going to be interesting to see how Doug and Jim Schwartz manage the playing time, but you're going to see a lot of young players and a lot of backups for a significant portion of the game.
The Eagles playing the Cowboys. Might be the last time that Dez Bryant's in a Cowboys uniform as we open it up a little bit more around the league. Dez Bryant telling the media, John, he's been playing with an injury all season long. It's hurt his performance, but he hasn't been listed on the injury report. Now, then he ducked out of the media portion of practice today for the Cowboys. Nobody saw him. Said he's not going to take a pay cut, though. He did say that in 2018. What do you think the future is for Dez Bryant?
Dez is not a dumb guy, so you throw it out there. I was fighting through an injury. The reality is, and I've been saying it, and you know, Pete, Dez has a big name. Dez used to be one of the top 5 receivers in the NFL, and he was in there with Julio Jones and A.J. Green and Antonio Brown. He was in that conversation. He's no longer that guy, and he hasn't been since he suffered that Jones fracture in his foot. He just has lost explosion as a player. He doesn't get separation. And one of the issues with the Cowboys is they don't have good receivers right now, and that obviously impacts Dak Prescott. People get caught up in names. And I would say the 2 biggest names, and you know, Pro Football Focus gets a lot of praise, a lot of criticism, but the one thing I always praise them for is they've made the average fan, the casual fan who reads their stuff, more educated, and who are actually good football players, who are actually bad football players, average. And people get caught up in names. I would say the 2 biggest names, Dez Bryant, Clay Matthews, to the casual fan, those are superstars because they used to be superstars. They're no longer superstars.
Well, you talk about big names, John McMullen. Is David Gettleman a big name? That's reportedly who the Giants have named as their new GM. He's a former GM of the Panthers, built that team that went to the Super Bowl, but he did have a Giants connection where he worked in the front office in scouting before. What are your thoughts on Dave Gettleman? David Gettleman.
If you were listening to Sports Bash 3 weeks ago, you knew Dave Gettleman was going to be the Giants general manager. He's actually a great personnel guy. He built really the Carolina Panthers roster you see today, in the one that was 15-1 a couple years ago. So he's a tremendous personnel guy. It will get him back going in the right direction from that standpoint. Where he ran into trouble in Carolina was sort of dealing with certain contracts and certain players that were very highly regarded in Charlotte. Josh Norman first. They had that whole issue where they put the franchise tag on him, then removed it and lost him and didn't get anything in return. And also Thomas Davis, who's a legend down there, and sort of Dave was butting heads about extending him, and that didn't go over well with Jerry Richardson. That's probably why he got fired more than anything. But personnel-wise, yeah, that's not good news for Eagles fans because he's top tier from that standpoint.
Why do I get the feeling that there's a good chance I was probably in the chair in studio when you said that guy's name? And Gil says all the time, PT, you got to listen more. I'm listening now, John McMullen. I'm listening now. I'll listen to this answer, too, from you, and I'll leave you with this one. So I do feel that the position was not valued to where it should have been. And look, you always like to feel that you provided value, and I would never want someone to fail and make myself look better. But I do believe that they never valued that position where it should have been, and maybe it's a wake-up call for some people around the league. Dean Blandino, the former senior VP of officiating who left for Fox, with the hot take today. What was your reaction when you saw him kind of throw Al Riveron under the bus?
Well, I that's another thing I said on the Sports Bash before the season. I said the NFL is going to have a big problem replacing Dean Blandino, and the reason why, I know a lot of people didn't like Dean. Nobody likes anybody in that position from the fans' perspective, but from somebody who covers the game, Dean Blandino was incredibly consistent. I mean, when you saw a replay, you knew what the eventuality was going to be. I mean, he was consistent from call to call, from game to game, always, and that hasn't been the case this year. And it has been wildly inconsistent. And now we know why Dean went to Fox, because he didn't feel valued by the NFL, and it's cost him. You could say the same thing about Mike Pereira, who was before Dean Blandino. He was also very consistent. And now they are where they are. And maybe they should value that position a little bit more. But I still think the bigger issue with the league and officiating is the over-legislation of the game. They've made it too sort of, when you look at these replays and you have to look at them 50 times and you're talking about a ball moving 2 inches. And, sometimes you just got to use common sense and say that guy made a great catch. It's a touchdown. Let's move on. Let's kick the extra point. Instant replay was originally put in to fix egregious errors. It's gone far beyond that. It's far overreaching. And they need to rethink the whole process. And it goes beyond replay. They need to think the whole process of the rule book, which is just overbearing at this point.
Nobody more consistent than John McMullen. He's our 97.3 ESPN Eagles insider, covers the league nationally as well. Read his insight on 97.3 ESPN. Find him on Twitter at JF McMullen. And his prediction is up on our website right now for the game. Won't give that away. We'll get that from you tomorrow, John. But good stuff out of you as always. Doug talks tomorrow. We'll talk to you tomorrow as well and find out the latest on the Eagles and the Cowboys. Thank you, buddy.
Hey, thanks, guys.